Hello, this is Chris Bryant. This is a presentation about how to optimize the persuasiveness of pro-vegan campaigns. In this presentation, I'll start with a discussion of strategy, including what areas to focus on to alleviate the most animal suffering. I'll talk about relevant factors to do with animal cruelty messages, health messages, and environmental messages. I'll then talk a bit about how we can frame messages most effectively and which demographic groups are likely to be the most receptive to pro-vegan messages. Finally, I'll talk about distribution media and where we should be putting the messages. So first off, I want to talk about strategy. My approach is based on the principles of effective altruism and is very utilitarian. That means I'm interested in alleviating the most possible animal suffering. This can sometimes lead to counterintuitive conclusions and some propositions which might seem a little cold and calculating, but I believe that focusing on the quantity of suffering is the best way to approach this problem, given that we have limited resources. So this means for each approach we should consider how many animals are affected, how badly they suffer, the length of time they suffer for, and other considerations, which might include their level of sentience or capacity for suffering. I want to say first that the focus of this presentation is on consumer-facing persuasive communications. It's actually likely that this is not the most effective use of an animal charity's resources. Other interventions like undercover investigations and corporate outreach are likely to help more animals per dollar spent. But most farmed animal charities will have at least some consumer-facing messages, so that's my focus here. So here we can see the proportion of money donated to animal charities in the USA. We can see that shelters, shown here in green, receive over 60% of all animal charity donations. Farmed animal charities, shown here in turquoise, receive just about 2%. And here we can see the proportion of animals in each of these situations. And as you can see, farmed animals, again shown in turquoise, make up over 99% of the animals that we could help. Animals in shelters are just this tiny sliver. They make up far less than 1%, but they receive over 60% of the donations. So looking at this data, putting resources towards helping farmed animals is likely to be the most effective use of resources for reducing animal suffering. Some people go further, and there are good arguments to be made that wild animals should be a priority since there are far more of them. I do think that could be true in a utilitarian sense, but wild animal suffering is outside of the scope of this presentation. This is the number of animals we kill for food each year in the UK. Often these huge numbers are very difficult to interpret meaningfully, since nobody can accurately imagine 3 million cows or 1 billion chickens. However, if we compare them in a pie chart, we can see how much of the total each of these different animals make up. As shown here, almost 95% of the land animals we kill are chickens. Cows, pigs, and the other animals combined make up just 5%. If we include all animals, the bulk is made up from fish and shellfish, with chickens still making up a considerable chunk. With these numbers, cows, pigs, sheep, ducks, and turkeys put together make up less than 1% of the animals we kill for food. Brian Tomasic has attempted to quantify the suffering associated with different animal products. His model accounts for how long the animals live, how much animal product they produce, how sentient they are, how bad their conditions are, and how bad their deaths are. He aggregates these figures to come up with a figure for equivalent days of suffering per kilogram of animal product demanded. You may think it's not really possible to quantify things like how sentient an animal is or how bad their conditions are, and Tomasic's website lets you input your own numbers for these fields. However, the results of his model are really not even close. As you can see, there's tremendous amounts of suffering associated with farmed fish, battery cage eggs, and chickens. A kilogram of pork, beef, and dairy, meanwhile, is associated with far less animal suffering. This is largely because you need more of these small animals to produce a kilogram of food, and because smaller animals tend to be kept in worse conditions. Now you may be thinking at this point, well, dairy cows still suffer a lot, and you're right, But fish and chickens just suffer more, and you need more of them to produce the same amount of food. Remember, these figures also account for the possibility that pigs and cows are in some sense more sentient than chickens and fish. Chicken and fish products really do entail more suffering. We also know that dairy products are generally considered the hardest to give up, as shown in this data from a survey of vegetarians, vegans, and some sympathetic meat eaters. Altogether, this suggests two things. Firstly, we should be focusing on farmed animals rather than animals used in labs or animals in shelters. Again, I have not considered wild animal suffering here, and that it is likely that that is worth our consideration as well. The second lesson is that to the extent that we focus on any animals in particular, we should focus on reducing consumption of fish, chickens, and eggs. So in this part of the presentation, I'll be talking about the most effective kinds of animal cruelty-based messages, and there's good reason to think that this is amongst the most effective type of message overall. In this survey of vegetarians and vegans, animal welfare was the most commonly given reason for avoiding animal products. A substantial proportion were also concerned about their health and the environment, but most said that animal welfare was their number one concern. We can see this in experimental studies too. When people are randomly allocated to reading an animal cruelty message, they're significantly more likely to say they would reduce their animal product consumption than those given an environmental message, and both trumped an abolitionist message. People given leaflets about animal cruelty also spared more animals in their subsequent dietary choices than those given leaflets about health, as shown here. This next slide has some grisly farm animal pictures, so if you don't want to see that, do look away now. These are some of the most impactful images from a recent study, where people were asked how much these images made them want to reduce their animal product consumption. These images all show forms of animal cruelty, but a more interesting theme to me is one of disgust. More than evoking empathy for the animals in these photos, these pictures just don't look like something that you'd want to eat. You can see blood and dirt on the animals, which we might associate with disease and dirtiness, and it could be that this disgust is motivating animal product avoidance. A recent study found that a disgust-based message was more effective than a health-based message, and at least as effective as an animal cruelty message at reducing intended animal product consumption. Now, because you looked at those gross pictures, you get some pictures of happy animals. Unsurprisingly, these were amongst the least impactful images in the survey. This chicken has actually been debeaked, but it seems that the average meat eater wouldn't recognize that. Basically, pictures of happy-looking animals are less effective at motivating meat avoidance. Okay, another grisly image warning, so look away now if you don't want to see this. These pictures were also very low impact. Although they show animal suffering, people on the whole are far less sensitive to fish suffering, so these images didn't motivate people to avoid animal products very much. This is probably because people tend to rate fish as less intelligent and less capable of suffering than other animals, as shown here. The hierarchy given is pretty much as you would expect, with chimps and dogs being rated as most similar to humans on average, followed by pigs, then cows, then chickens, then fish. You might not think it from arguing with meat eaters, but people rate plants as the least sentient of all. This presents us with a problem because, as we know, fish and chickens make up the bulk of farmed animal suffering, but people are least concerned about them. And that probably explains this finding. Leaflets with images of chickens only were far less persuasive than leaflets which also included pictures of pigs and cows. One study found that those who were persuaded to stop eating mammals also ate less chicken, so it might still be best to use pictures of pigs and cows, even though we're mainly concerned about the consumption of chickens and fish. As shown here, messages about disease and water quality are the most persuasive when it comes to reducing fish consumption specifically. They're also more likely to make people avoid restaurants associated with the practice. When we look at other less impactful issues discussed, such as overcrowding and slaughter, the idea that consumers are primarily motivated by disgust becomes more prominent again. since this would be activated when thinking about dirty and diseased water. Now I'm going to discuss how we can think about health messages, again with a focus on reducing animal suffering. A big problem here is that the health problems associated with red meat and dairy are more well documented and more well known than other animal products. Health motivated consumers might therefore avoid red meat and dairy and could end up eating more fish and white meat as a result. And as we know, that's actually going to result in more animal suffering. So this survey data suggests an interesting difference between vegetarians and vegans versus omnivores and meat reducers. As we can see, vegans and vegetarians were mainly motivated by animal welfare concerns, whereas omnivores and meat reducers were mainly motivated by health concerns. There's also some evidence that older people are more concerned about the health implications of their diet than younger people. Now, this is in tension with some of the experimental findings I discussed earlier, and suggests that refining health arguments and aligning them with our concerns about animal welfare should also be a priority. Of those who said health concerns are important, most are concerned about reducing the risk of disease and avoiding contamination. Losing weight and improving well-being are less common reasons here. One way we can operationalize this is to shift the focus from long-term diseases associated with red meat consumption to contamination and disease associated with white meat consumption. As shown here, many foodborne diseases are more prevalent in chicken than they are in pork. This is definitely an area which warrants more research, but those concerned about animal suffering should work out how to align health-motivated consumers with reducing consumption of white meat and eggs. Again, those who replace red meat with more white meat are almost certainly causing more animal suffering. So let's talk about messages focused on the environment. There's some evidence that these messages resonate more with younger consumers, but we come up against a similar problem for animal suffering. As shown here, the animal products with the highest environmental impact are red meat and dairy. Chicken and fish are relatively innocent with regards to greenhouse gas emissions, and again, consumers with an environmental angle might end up eating more of these products in place of red meat and dairy. This is a problem for animal advocates to be aware of, and pressing the broad categories of vegetarianism and veganism could be a way to address this. This 2017 systematic review found that the majority of the studies suggest that consumers are not aware that production and consumption of meat has a huge impact on the environment. Some of these studies are now a few years old, and awareness of this link has certainly increased, but there could still be a place for promoting the environmental message further, since most people simply don't know that this link exists. Let's talk about message framing, and here I'll discuss the original studies that I have done at Viva. So this is data from a survey of 1,000 UK meat eaters. We can see the proportion of people with a positive, negative, and neutral view of each of these aspects of veganism. As we can see, most meat eaters already think that veganism is healthy, ethical, and good for the environment. It seems that these benefits are already fairly well known. The big areas where there are negative opinions of veganism are ease, enjoyability, taste, affordability, and convenience. These roughly collapse into three main barriers: taste, price, and convenience. With the recent launch of more high-quality vegan products in supermarkets and restaurant chains, new vegans will find that any deficits in taste and convenience are far less severe than they might have been just a year ago. With regards to affordability, this is probably a misconception, since most animal products are usually amongst the most expensive in any given shop. So pointing to cheap, easy vegan dishes, which avoid unfamiliar ingredients like tofu and quinoa, could help address this misconception and demonstrate that veganism can be easy, cheap, and fuss-free. This study found that leaflets focused on how to go vegan were about 50% more effective than leaflets focused on why to go vegan. It could be more important to address barriers to veganism than continuing to highlight the reasons why to change. In a second study, I tested 3 pro-vegan posters. Each poster had the same image of a pig, and the caption, "Buying animal products funds animal cruelty." The bottom half varied between "Go vegan," "Try vegan," and "Join the vegan movement," with 100 people seeing each different version. As shown here, the "Go vegan" message was the least persuasive, with just 18% saying they intended to reduce their animal product consumption. This jumps to 28% for the other two versions. I should say that this difference was not statistically significant by the fairly stringent standards of social science, but if I was a decision maker looking at these results, I would avoid a "Go vegan" message. Other similar studies have found some evidence that avoiding the term vegan is probably helpful too. Advocates could opt instead for messages like "leave animals off your plate," rather than using the V word. This next study investigated one way of avoiding the vegan label. Meat-eating participants had to choose a dish from a menu that they saw online. They saw one of 3 versions of the menu, each with 3 vegan, 3 meat, and 3 vegetarian options. In this version, vegan dishes were labelled VE and vegetarian dishes were labelled V. I also tested a version where vegetarian and vegan options were not labelled, the idea being that meat eaters might use these labels as a sign of what dishes to avoid. However, this version would make it harder for vegetarians and vegans to identify dishes for them. So I also tested this version, where vegetarian options are labelled M for meat-free and vegan options are labelled P for plant-based. Now, as you can see here, when vegan options were labelled VE, they were chosen by just 13% of the participants. This jumped to 24% for the other menu labelling systems, and selection of meat options also fell in these menus. Again, these findings didn't quite reach statistical significance, but the pattern is clear, and it's also in line with other findings that plant-based is a far more appealing label than vegan. Encouraging restaurants and retailers to use the label plant-based instead of the label vegan would likely increase the proportion of meat eaters choosing vegan dishes. As advocacy organizations, we should be using A/B testing to continually test this type of thing. We can increase the effectiveness of most things that we do, certainly with messaging. Mercy for Animals have some great resources for open sourcing this testing, including some scripts anyone can use to test different versions of persuasive and fundraising messages. Testing as we go and doing more of what works will enable us to help more animals. I'll talk now briefly about the groups who are most receptive to pro-vegan messages. First, I want to say that nominal support for pro-vegan policies is surprisingly high. As shown here, most American consumers agree that animals can feel and that farm animal welfare is important. There's also shockingly high agreement amongst the general population that factory farms and slaughterhouses should be banned, and that farmed animals deserve the same consideration as pets. And we have to think that people don't really understand the implications of what they're agreeing to here, but the point is that a lot of people actually agree with vegan ethics more than we might think. So messages which reach a broad audience are likely to be the best overall. However, if you have a limited budget, you will want to focus only on reaching the most receptive demographics, for example through social media. The list of attributes associated with veganism is probably fairly predictable for advocates who have been doing this for a while. They're female, young, left-leaning, city-dwelling, intelligent or well-educated, high income, not followers of Judeo-Christian religions, LGBT, single, artistic, and introverted. Now, some of these are more useful than others, but most of these can be selected for directly or by association with other interests on Facebook, for example. I shall talk now about what we know about distribution media for pro-vegan messages. The most well-studied media are leaflets and social media adverts. A couple of studies have found these to be effective in that people who see these messages are more likely to reduce their animal product consumption compared to control groups, but some studies have found no difference. Overall, the evidence suggests that these interventions are probably somewhat effective, but they may not be the best use of resources. Mercy for Animals have studied what elements of Facebook posts help them to get the most views. Facebook is the most widely used social media platform and is the main place advocates should focus on sharing messages. According to this analysis of hundreds of Facebook posts, the main lessons are to post lots of videos, evoke strong emotions, use very few words, and ask followers to share the post rather than like or comment. Content with baby animals and showing farm animals alongside companion animals also does well. One thing we don't know a lot about is billboards. It's very difficult to study the effectiveness of billboards, since it's not easy to measure outcomes or to tell who's seen it. However, there is good reason to think that they might be effective. Firstly, we know that images of animal cruelty are very persuasive, but we also know that people actively avoid these images. A billboard is more difficult to avoid than a flyer or a Facebook ad, so this could be more effective in just getting the message in front of people. Secondly, it's possible that being on a billboard gives the message more credibility compared to a leaflet, for example. We should also think about traditional news media coverage of animal issues, including welfare reforms. Now, some animal rights activists might be reluctant to share or celebrate news of welfare reforms, since it could send the message that using animals is okay as long as they're in good enough conditions. For this reason, PETA opposed the recent welfare reform bill in California. However, there is good evidence from several different studies that reading about animal welfare reforms is actually linked to a decrease in consumption of animal products. That is to say, these stories seem not to have the effect of justifying animal product consumption that animal rights activists might fear. This has been shown experimentally and in real-world data. And for this reason, advocates should celebrate and encourage these welfare reforms. Here we can see data on what forms of media first influence people to avoid animal products. Social media and leaflets are down here in fairly low percentages, whereas the most popular source of influence is documentaries and movies. Films such as Earthlings and Cowspiracy have been very influential in changing behaviour for some consumers, and this is a media worth exploring. Indeed, there is a history of some activists actually paying people to watch these documentaries. Of course, most people realise that they're going to see unpleasant scenes, and they might feel bad, so they avoid it. This intervention hasn't been studied formally, but anecdotally, the activists who organised this screening found that many viewers refused the money afterwards and wanted to know how they could help. This could be very high impact, particularly for students or other low-income demographics. Finally, this study investigated the effect of a daily text message reminder on motivated consumers' ability to reduce their consumption of processed meat. They found that those who received daily text reminders consumed significantly less processed meat than those who did not receive a text. Texts, emails, or push notifications from apps could be a good way to keep new meat reducers motivated, and advocacy organisations could consider using this as an intervention. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you'd like to ask any questions or give feedback on any of this, please feel free to reach out to me via email. I believe it's very important for animal advocates to think about the evidence about what works. At the end of the day, this is going to enable us to help more animals, and that is what we all want. Thanks for watching.